On my 68th birthday, the world felt smaller than it used to be. Birthdays weren't the kind of thing I celebrated anymore. Not since Linda passed, and certainly not since Ethan stopped showing up. The day began like most others, coffee cooling too fast in the kitchen, the house echoing with a silence that didn't belong to anyone but me. That's when I saw the package. It sat on the porch like an uninvited guest, plain cardboard, no ribbons, no colorful wrapping, not even to Dad or from Ethan. Just my name and address scrawled across the top. The handwriting was familiar enough to pull me back 3 years in an instant. Even before I slit the tape, I knew. My son had sent it. The box wasn't heavy, but it carried more weight than it should have. Inside, nestled in crumpled brown paper, was a whiskey bottle. Not just any whiskey, a limited edition bottle, the kind collectors leave sealed on a shelf, more treasure than drink. The glass was thick, the label deep green with gold lettering, and the cork sealed with wax that gleamed under the light. If you didn't know better, you'd think this bottle was meant to be admired, not consumed. My thumb ran over the wax seal out of habit. Whiskey used to be my ritual, not my vice. A small pour at the end of long days fixing fence posts or sitting on the porch with Linda, the swing creaking while the crickets took up their song. That was before the heart attack. Before the doctor spelled out the long list of things I could no longer touch if I wanted to see 70. Whiskey wasn't just off limits, it was a reminder of what had been taken from me. Ethan knew that. He was there in the hospital room when the doctor told me straight. He didn't say much, just kept his eyes on his phone, thumbs moving across the screen while I stared at my new reality. I told myself he was trying to cope in his own way, but in truth, the silence grew roots that never stopped spreading. After the hospital came the skipped dinners. After skipped dinners came missed holidays. Thanksgiving chairs went empty. Christmas lights glowed over cold plates. One absence became two, then three, until I realized we weren't speaking at all. That's the thing about silence. It doesn't crash in all at once. It creeps in like fog until one day you look around and realize you can't see what used to be right in front of you. So when that bottle appeared on my doorstep, wrapped in Ethan's unmistakable handwriting, it wasn't joy that struck me. Not relief, either. Just a strange heaviness pressing on my chest, the kind that has no name but feels permanent. Taped to the side of the box was an envelope. Inside, a card. Just 2 words. Happy birthday. No, Dad. No. Love. Ethan. No signature. Just the bare minimum, as though more words might have cost him too much. I set the card down, slid the bottle across the kitchen table, and went back to my coffee. Cold now. Bitter. The clock over the stove ticked on, filling the empty house with its metronome of loneliness. I looked at the whiskey again, catching the way the morning sun cut through the blinds and set the liquid glowing as though it held fire. It was beautiful, I'll give it that. But beauty doesn't erase history, and beauty doesn't change behavior. Ethan had sent me something I couldn't use, something he knew I couldn't use, and that alone made the gesture strange enough to not end. Was it guilt? A peace offering? A careless, thoughtless act from a son who hadn't been part of my life for years? I didn't have answers, only questions that made the air heavy. All I knew was this: whatever Ethan meant by it, the gift felt less like a bridge and more like a stone dropped into deep water. The ripples would come. I just didn't know yet how far they'd reach. That bottle didn't belong to me. Not anymore. It sat there glowing in the morning light like a secret I hadn't asked for. And in my gut, I already knew this gift wasn't just a mistake. It was the beginning of something I couldn't yet name. The whiskey stayed on my table for most of the morning, like an object that carried too much meaning to be thrown away and too much danger to be opened. I kept glancing at it, not in longing but in unease. Years ago, a bottle like that would have been a gift worth savoring. Now it was nothing but glass and memory, a reminder of what I couldn't have and what Ethan should have remembered. That's when Robert Carson came to mind. Robert wasn't family by blood, but he might as well have been. Ethan had married his daughter, Leah, and through that, Robert and I had grown close in the way men do, by showing up when work needs to be done. He was the kind of man who didn't ask whether you needed help. He just arrived with a hammer in his hand and a truck bed full of tools. 2 summers ago, after a storm had peeled shingles off my roof, I woke up to find him already on a ladder before I'd finished my first cup of coffee. When the gutters clogged, Robert was there. When a tree limb nearly tore through the fence, he had it cut and cleared before I could thank him. He never wanted anything in return. But if there was anyone who deserved something nice, it was him. And so, by the time the clock ticked past noon, I'd made my decision. The bottle didn't belong to me. I couldn't drink it. Letting it collect dust on my shelf felt like keeping something beautiful locked in a cage. Robert would appreciate it. He'd share it with friends, tell a story with it, make it mean something more than wasted glass. That felt right. I buckled the bottle into the passenger seat of my old Chevy before heading out. Some habits you don't question. Maybe I just didn't want it rattling around. Maybe I knew on some level it wasn't just liquor I was carrying. The October light slanted across the fields, turning the cut soybeans gold. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke, the kind of afternoon where the world feels steady. Robert's house sat on a rise at the edge of town, the kind of white clapboard home you'd see on a postcard. He met me at the door in a red flannel shirt, sawdust still clinging to his boots. His eyes went straight to the bottle in my hands. "Frank, what's this?" he asked. "From Ethan," I said, holding it out. He raised his eyebrows. "Ethan sent you this?" "Yeah," I nodded. "Figured you'd enjoy it more than I would." Robert turned it in his hands, studying the label like it was a museum piece. "This is something, Frank. The kind of bottle you put away for a special night. Then make tonight special," I told him. And I meant it. His grin was wide, genuine. "I think I will. Thank you." Something about handing it over felt right in the moment, like setting down a burden that wasn't mine to carry. Driving home, the late light poured across the dashboard, and for a brief moment I felt lighter too. But then came the itch, the question I couldn't shake. Ethan had never been one to spend money recklessly. Half the time, he was borrowing cash for gas and forgetting to pay it back. This bottle wasn't cheap, not by any stretch. Why would he buy it? Why send it to me, of all people, when he knew I couldn't drink? I told myself to let it go. Not everything has a reason. But I didn't believe it, not even for a second. That night, I cooked a pot roast. The smell of onions and carrots filled the house, the kind of meal meant for company, but eaten alone. I was scrubbing the last plate when the phone rang, an old landline that almost never rang anymore. I picked it up. "Hello, Dad." Ethan's voice, smooth, casual, like 3 years of silence hadn't passed. For a moment, I just leaned against the counter, the weight of it pressing down. "Ethan," I said. "Happy birthday," he added, too late for it to sound natural. "You got my gift?" I did. "Well, what'd you think?" "It's a nice bottle," I said. "You try it yet?" His tone sharpened just slightly. "No," I told him. "I gave it to Robert. Thought he'd get more use out of it." Silence. Heavy. Deliberate. "You gave it to Robert," he repeated, his voice cooling. "That's right." A long exhale hissed through the line. Then, click. The call ended. I stood there with the receiver still in my hand, the clock ticking in the kitchen, the roast settling heavy in my stomach. His pause, the way he'd asked about the whiskey, it mattered to him in a way it shouldn't have. And suddenly, I wasn't sure if I'd given Robert a gift or passed him a curse. The next morning began the way they all did. Coffee, newspaper, the steady tick of the clock in a house too empty for its own good. I tried to push away the unease from Ethan's strange phone call the night before, but it clung to me like smoke. By midday, the phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Ethan. The caller ID showed a local number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in my gut told me to pick up. "Mr. Dalton?" A woman's voice asked. "Yes, this is him. This is Linda Carson, Robert's wife." Her tone was tight, strained, like words forced through clenched teeth. "I thought you should know. Robert's in the hospital." The coffee cup in my hand turned cold in an instant. "The hospital? What happened?" "He collapsed this morning. The doctors think it might be some kind of poisoning." That word, poisoning, landed like a blow to the chest. Linda's voice wavered. He was fine last night. We had a drink with dinner, and this morning he could barely stand. They're running tests, but it doesn't look good. I didn't speak. My eyes drifted across the kitchen to the empty space on the counter where the whiskey had been less than 24 hours before. Did he eat anything unusual? She asked. My throat felt dry as sand. No, but I gave him a bottle yesterday. Whiskey. From Ethan. There was a pause. In the background, I could hear the muffled chaos of the hospital, monitors beeping, voices paging over intercoms, a cart squeaking down a hallway. I'll tell the doctors, she said finally. If you think of anything else, anything, call me. I promised I would, though my mind was already racing ahead. Poisoning. Whiskey. Ethan's sudden, unnerving phone call. His pause when I told him Robert had the bottle. After I hung up, I just stood in the kitchen, the October light pale and flat, everything around me suddenly colder. The house felt like it was holding its breath. Then I saw it. Something white near the bottom of the trash bin. A small plastic vial, like the kind vitamins come in. No label. Just a faint dusting of powder clinging to the inside. I didn't remember throwing it away. My hands shook as I pulled it out, the cap screwed on tight. I stared at it, my stomach tightening. I opened the fridge. There, on the middle shelf, was a mason jar. Inside was about half a cup of whiskey I'd poured off for Robert to taste before handing him the bottle. I hadn't even remembered keeping it until that moment. Now the jar and the vial sat side by side on my counter, two silent witnesses to something I didn't want to name yet. I knew what I had to do. Gary. Gary and I had served together 3 decades ago. These days, he ran a small veterinary lab on the edge of town. He owed me a favor. Once upon a winter, I'd pulled his truck out of a ditch during an ice storm. If anyone could tell me what was in that whiskey, it was him. I called. My voice was low, steady. Gary, I need you to test something for me. What is it? He asked. Whiskey. And maybe something else. He didn't press me. Just told me to meet him after closing. That evening, I drove out to his lab, the mason jar wrapped in a paper bag riding in the passenger seat. The road stretched quiet and empty, the kind of silence that didn't comfort. Gary met me in the parking lot, lab coat over a sweatshirt, the faint smell of disinfectant clinging to the air. He looked at me hard, like he already suspected more than I'd said. This the kind of thing I'm going to regret? He asked. Just tell me what's in it, I said. He nodded, took the bag, and disappeared inside. I sat in my truck, engine running, headlights carving long shadows against the building. The radio stayed off. My thoughts circled the last 24 hours, the package on the porch, Ethan's voice over the phone, Robert grinning as he held the bottle. I stayed there until the sun slid below the horizon, the world turning dark and uncertain. The next day, Gary called. His voice was low, grim. Frank, you're not going to like this. Say it anyway. There's something in the whiskey. White snake root. The name alone felt poisonous. In the right dose, Gary continued, it'll stop a man's heart. And from what I see, it was measured carefully. I closed my eyes, the phone heavy in my hand. You said Robert drank this? Yes. And you didn't? No. He let out a slow breath. Then, Frank, you might have just dodged a bullet. And that's where the truth began to take shape. The whiskey wasn't just a careless gift. It wasn't just a bottle. It was a message. A weapon. And whether Robert survived or not, I already knew one thing. Ethan hadn't sent me a gift at all. He'd sent me a warning. When Gary's words landed, white snake root, lethal dose, the room around me seemed to shrink. The sound of his voice hung heavy, the kind of news that doesn't echo but presses down like a stone. I'd heard of the plant only in passing, a poisonous weed tucked in old farm stories. Farmers used to lose cattle to it, their milk turning toxic after the animals grazed on it. But for someone to extract it, to measure it, to lace whiskey with it, that wasn't an accident. That was intent. And intent was worse than poison. I hung up and sat still, the kitchen too quiet, the clock ticking out seconds I couldn't account for. My eyes drifted back to the mason jar on the counter. The whiskey curled lazily against the glass, innocent to the eye, deadly by design. Beside it sat the small white vial, Light enough to forget, dangerous enough to kill. I picked it up again. No label, no markings. Just that faint dusting of powder clinging to the inside like it refused to let go. My gut told me one thing clear. It didn't belong in my trash. I hadn't thrown it away, which meant someone else had. That thought made my skin crawl. I checked the locks on the doors, the windows, the back entrance through the garage. Everything looked normal. No scratches, no forced entry. But normal doesn't mean safe. The vial had been in my house, in my trash. That was fact. And if it wasn't me, then who? I called Gary back, voice low. It's gone. What is the vial? Someone took it from my trash. The bag was lifted, put back wrong. Gary didn't try to reassure me. He knew better. Frank, you need law enforcement looped in. I can document what's in the whiskey, but that vial would have been proof of handling. Whoever took it knew that. He was right. Proof was gone. But suspicion? Suspicion was everywhere now. I poured myself another coffee just to keep my hands busy. It went cold before I touched it. The walls of the house felt different, as though they'd been watching me instead of the other way around. I needed control. Some kind of order. So I sat down at the table with a legal pad, drew a line down the center, and made 2 lists. What I know. Ethan sent the bottle. Ethan asked if I'd tried it. Ethan's tone changed when I told him Robert had it. The whiskey tested positive for white snakeroot. The vial was missing. What I can prove. Gary's test results. The leftover whiskey in the jar. Ethan's phone call, if memory held. The gap between those columns was a canyon. What I knew was enough to keep me up at night. What I could prove was what the law cared about. Bridges don't build themselves, and I was staring at empty space. So I reached for an old tool. A small digital voice recorder, scuffed at the corners, something I'd used years back when Linda was still alive, and I wanted to keep her voice around longer than memory allowed. I checked the battery. Half full. I slid it into my jacket pocket. Its weight was steady against my chest, a reminder to breathe. If Ethan had sent me a message, then I needed to start collecting my own. By noon, I was in my truck, heading toward Ethan's neighborhood. I told myself I just wanted to talk, but the truth was sharper than that. I wanted to see him, to look him in the eye, to catch what silence couldn't hide. His house sat neat and clean in one of those developments where every home looked like a cousin of the next. Neutral siding, brass numbers, trimmed lawns that never seemed to grow weeds. His truck was in the driveway, newer than mine, spotless. I knocked. When he opened the door, his expression shifted twice before landing. Surprise, then calculation, then a smile he felt like joy. Dad, he said, this is not is it? I looked, stepping inside without a word. The air smelled like lemon fresh. Everything was right in there. Books on the shelf, looked more like decoration than this. Too hot. Too careful. He gestured toward the kitchen, where 3 bottles sat lying over the table. 2 gorgeous, one large. None the same as the one he'd sent me. None of them open. Did you try the bottle yourself? He laughed softly. The whole place was beneath my breath. I know, I would like it. You know, I don't drink it. People change. He's grown. My eyes moved to the empty glass by the sink. Robert said his favorite color was the United States. The singer laughed. He blinked once, too slow. Then, funny thing, I said, voice back. I never told him where it was at. For the smallest moment, he froze, still as an animal that hears a twig snap. Then he smiled, too practiced. You must have. You get chatty when you're sentimental. I didn't, I said, and held his eyes until he had to look away. Silence filled the kitchen. Not empty silence, living silence. The kind that waits, heavy, knowing it has already said enough. I left before he could find more words. As I walked out, I felt the recorder heavy in my jacket. Proof was still thin, but I had something now. Something real. And more than that, I had certainty. The drive home from Ethan's house felt longer than it was. My hands stayed steady on the wheel, but inside my chest, the air was tight. That silence in his kitchen, The pause, the blink, the practiced laugh. It told me more than any confession ever could. When I pulled into my driveway, the house greeted me with the same quiet I'd left behind. Only now, that quiet didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like something lurking, waiting. I set the recorder on the table and pressed play. His voice filled the room. The whole point was for you to enjoy it. People change. You must have told me. Listening to it again, I heard the cracks more clearly, the careful tones, the misplaced certainty, the denial rehearsed. It wasn't proof in the eyes of the law, but to me, it was the voice of a man caught in the middle of his own trap. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat at the kitchen table, the mason jar of whiskey still on the counter, the legal pad of notes in front of me. Every line, every word I wrote became heavier. Ethan's gift. Ethan's call. Ethan's silence. Morning came, pale and thin. I poured coffee, didn't drink it, and stared out at the yard that refused to stay green. The world outside carried on. A man raked leaves with his son down the block. A dog barked at nothing in particular. But inside, my own world was narrowing. By midday, the phone rang again. This time, I knew the voice instantly. "Dad," Ethan said, smooth, almost casual. "We need to talk. Sooner is better than later." He let the pause hang there. A test. I didn't answer right away. Just let the silence stretch long enough for him to hear what he'd already told me without words. Finally, I said, "We talked yesterday. Not enough." His tone sharpened, clipped. "You think too much, Dad. You always have." "I think just enough," I replied. Another pause. Not static, not a dropout, just him breathing, holding something back. Then the line went dead. I sat there, phone heavy in my hand, the clock ticking in the kitchen like it wanted to mark every heartbeat. Later that evening, I drove back to Ethan's. Call it stubbornness, call it recklessness, but I needed to see him again. Needed to stand in front of him and let silence do the work words couldn't. He opened the door with that same half smile, the one that said he thought he was still in control. "Dad," he said. "Back again?" "This isn't a social call," I told him, stepping inside. The house smelled of lemon again, too clean, too staged. He gestured toward the kitchen like before, but I didn't sit. Instead, I stood near the counter, close enough to see the other bottles lined up, untouched. "I'm going to ask you one question," I said. My voice was steady, low, and I'm going to let the silence after it tell me the answer. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing like he was playing chess and waiting for my move. "Okay. Did you tamper with that whiskey?" The words dropped into the room like stones into water. And then, nothing. The fridge hummed. The clock on the microwave ticked from 12:09 to 12:10. A car passed outside, slow enough that the tires whispered against pavement. Ethan didn't move, didn't speak. His silence was alive, pulsing between us. I held his eyes. He held mine. Finally, I said, "Goodbye, Ethan." I turned toward the door. "Dad," he said behind me, his voice a hook and a warning all at once. I stopped, but I didn't turn back. "You keep accusing me of things," he said. "You'll push me away." "I'm not accusing," I told the door. "I'm collecting." And then I walked out. Outside, the air was sharp, metallic in my lungs. In the truck, I pressed my thumb against the recorder in my pocket, clicked the red light off, and set it on the seat beside me. Silence had spoken, and it said more than guilt or innocence ever could. When I left Ethan's house that second time, I knew the silence wasn't going to be enough. It told me the truth, but truth without proof is nothing more than suspicion. Suspicion doesn't hold up in court. Suspicion doesn't protect anyone. That night, I sat at my table, the recorder on one side, the mason jar of whiskey on the other, the legal pad in front of me. The gap between what I knew and what I could prove hadn't shrunk. If anything, it had widened. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I'd been putting off since Gary first said white snake root. "Detective Reyes," a voice answered after 2 rings. "This is Frank Dalton," I said. "I believe I may have information about a poisoning." He didn't ask for my whole story right then. Just gave me a time, an office number, and told me to bring whatever I had. Men who know their work don't demand the truth in the first breath. The next morning, I slid the mason jar into a Ziploc bag, sealed it, then tucked it inside an old cigar tin. I added the recorder and a copy of my notes. Then I put the tin in a paper bag and layered another bag over it. Paranoia? Maybe. But after that missing vial, double layers felt less like fear and more like common sense. At the station, Reyes met me in a small office with a window that stared at a brick wall. He was younger than me, older than a rookie, the kind of man whose tie had been straightened more than once that morning. He offered me water. I said yes, because refusing everything a man offers makes you look like you've already decided not to trust him. Tell me about the whiskey, he said. So I did. The package, Ethan's handwriting, the missing vial, Gary's test results, Ethan's questions on the phone, the silence that weighed heavier than words. I gave him the facts, not the theories. Let him stack the cards however he saw fit. When I set the bag on his desk and pulled out the mason jar and the recorder, he didn't touch them right away. He just let them sit there like tools at the start of a job. You understand, he said finally. This doesn't become a case because you and I both feel it. It becomes a case when what you've handed me can survive other people looking at it. I do, I said. I want other people to look at it. He nodded, then leaned back. Who else has keys to your house? No one, I said. Any signs of forced entry? None. Any spares hidden? I shook my head. No rocks, no mats. I don't play that game. Has anyone else had access to your keys in the last few years? The answer wanted to be never. But truth doesn't care what you want. I thought back. 5 years ago, the heart attack. Ethan had stopped by the house while I was in the hospital. Brought me slippers, sweatpants, my phone charger. I thanked him for remembering the charger, never asked him about my keys. I think he had them then, I said slowly. I don't recall him handing them back. Reyes didn't look surprised. He didn't look pleased either. He just wrote it down. That helps explain the missing vial, he said. If someone entered without force, that detail matters. I sat back in my chair, the weight of that small fact heavier than the rest. My own keys. My own blood. My own door. Reyes slid a card across the desk. My cell. If you sense something's off, call. I'd rather be wrong twice than right too late. I took the card. The paper felt thin, but the promise behind it felt solid. For the first time since the whiskey arrived, it felt like someone else was willing to carry a corner of the weight. But the silence didn't ease. It just changed shape. That evening, back at the house, I checked the locks again. Front door. Back door. Garage entrance with a stubborn latch. All set. All normal. And yet, normal no longer meant safe. Because somewhere out there, someone had my key. Robert Carson didn't look like the man who'd once climbed my roof without asking. When I walked into his hospital room, he looked smaller, his skin pale, his breath slow but stubborn. Machines beeped quietly at his bedside, a metronome that reminded everyone in the room that his heart was running on borrowed steadiness. Linda was there too, sitting close enough that her knees brushed the bed frame. Her hands were clasped together at her chest, not in prayer, but in a way that suggested she was holding something invisible, afraid it might leak through her fingers. Frank, she said softly, thank you for coming. How is he? They're trying to stabilize his heart rhythm. They said they found signs of some kind of plant toxin. They're still running tests. Her voice cracked at the edges. I didn't press her for more. Instead, I stepped closer to Robert. His mouth was slightly open, pulling in shallow breaths. His hair had fallen loose across his forehead, making him look younger and at the same time more fragile. He wasn't family on paper, but blood isn't the only measure of closeness. Sometimes family is the man who shows up at your door with a ladder when a storm takes half your shingles. Sometimes family is the one who fixes your fence before you can ask. That was Robert. Did he eat anything unusual last night? I asked quietly. Linda shook her head. Nothing. We both had one glass with dinner. He said it was the nicest whiskey he'd ever tasted. Wanted to save the rest for something special. My jaw tightened without my permission. I told her to make sure the doctors knew exactly that. it was a new, unopened bottle, and that I could provide them with a sample from the same source. She reached out like she might grab my hand, but at the last second she gripped the bed rail instead. "Frank," she said, "what is this? Do you think?" "I don't know what I think," I cut in. "But I'll find out." The doctor came and went, speaking in confident tones about rhythms that changes, about what they mean and what they did. I waited until he left before speaking to the doctor. That's when I saw him. Leah, my daughter, Ethan's wife. He'd only spoken words of the time since they left, always polite, like neighbors who made sweet sweet potatoes. But when she walked toward me, her eyes gleamed straight, her hands nervous. I knew this wasn't a neighborly visit. "Frank," she said, her voice low, "we need to talk." We stepped into a small family room. The coffee machine smelled faintly and clean, filling the room with the scent of clean clothes. Neither of us spoke. "I don't know what you mean," but I know Ethan is not different. "So am I." "Business. Secret. He keeps jars in the shelf on the line. Dried plants. That's it. Going on like this without further distraction. I didn't think." She swallowed hard. "I didn't think it connected to this." "White snake root," I said. "Have you heard that name?" Her eyes flicked in recognition, or fear, or both. "Yes. I've seen it in his search history." I thought he was just reading. "Detective Reyes will want to talk to you," I told her. "If you're willing." I already called. Left a message. Relief and grief are cousins. I felt one visiting on behalf of the other. "Leah," I said gently, "if you have anything, screenshots, messages, photos of those jars, keep them. Let the detective pull the thread." She looked at me long enough to see me, really see me. "Why would he do this to you?" I could have said money, or love, or disappointments that had grown hooks. But the truth was simpler, sharper. Because if he can't own the story, I told her, he'll burn the page. She flinched like the words carried a draft. "He asked me this morning if I'd heard from you," she whispered. "Said he wanted to know if you liked the bottle." Her voice broke on the last word. And in that silence, both of us knew the truth. The gift wasn't a gift at all. It was a weapon. And Ethan had aimed it at me. Detective Reyes had warned me that cases don't move fast, not unless they have to. But this one didn't crawl. It sprinted. Every new hour seemed to pull another thread loose, and each one was knotted with Ethan's name. The call came late afternoon. Reyes's tone was even, but beneath it was something heavier. "Frank," he said, "we served the warrant." My chest tightened. "And we found jars in the garage, labeled. 2 with dried plants consistent with white snakeroot, a third with liquid extract, and a notebook." He didn't have to explain what kind of notebook. "I'll bring it by," he added. "You'll want to see it." When he laid it on my kitchen table that evening, it looked almost ordinary. A simple spiral-bound pad, the kind a high schooler might keep for algebra homework. But the second I saw the handwriting, my stomach turned. Ethan's loops on the G's, the way he pressed so hard the ink bit into the page. I knew it like I knew the shape of my own hands. Reyes flipped it open. Pages filled with dates, dosage estimates, measurements written in shorthand. Some entries neat, others hurried, but all of them deliberate. "Here," Reyes said, tapping a page. The date was 6 months earlier. Next to it, a symbol, a triangle, followed by the initials RC. Robert Carson. My chest felt hollow. 2 pages later, another entry. A larger number this time. No triangle. No half dose. Just the letters FD. Frank Dalton. My name. My initials sitting beside numbers that Gary's voice echoed in my mind. Lethal dose. Gary was on speakerphone, his voice crackling through the line as Reyes showed him the pages. That triangle. In veterinary shorthand, it means half dose. The asterisk usually means observe for delayed effect. And that number by FD. He paused. "Frank, that's not a test. That's final. That's enough to stop a man's heart outright." I gripped the edge of the table, steadying myself. I'd faced down worse in uniform, but nothing prepares you for seeing your own death written in your son's hand. Reyes watched me carefully. This isn't just suspicion anymore. This is intent. Documented. The words hung there, colder than the October wind rattling my windows. I closed the notebook slowly, the paper rasping under my palm. My initials burned through the cover as if the ink itself had heat. This isn't a case of recklessness, Gary added over the phone. A man doesn't make notes like this by accident. He was testing, measuring, practicing. Practice. The word chilled me more than poison. Practice meant repetition. Practice meant Robert hadn't been the first name in those pages. I flipped back, scanning earlier entries. Some only had symbols. Some had numbers without initials. One page had a simple word written next to the date, test. And suddenly, I saw the pattern. This wasn't the first attempt. It was just the first that had nearly killed someone I cared about. I pushed the notebook back across the table, the scrape of cardboard loud in the quiet kitchen. Reyes bagged it carefully, sealing it away. This, he said, is what prosecutors call a smoking gun. But it also means you need to be careful. If Ethan realizes what we found, he may act desperate. Don't meet him. Don't answer his calls. If he shows up, call us. I nodded, though my jaw was tight. Understood. When they left, the house didn't feel safer. It felt exposed, like the notebook had left behind a shadow, one that spread across every wall. I walked to the fridge, pulled out the mason jar, and held it to the light. A swirl of amber caught the bulb overhead. Innocent to the eye, fatal in truth. The notebook had confirmed what I already knew in my bones. Ethan hadn't just tried to send me a message. He'd tried to erase me. And in his handwriting, in his numbers, in his symbols, I'd found the proof. What I knew and what I could prove had finally crossed the same line. But the cost of knowing? That had only just begun. Courtrooms don't look the way they do on television. They're smaller, quieter, more ordinary. Fluorescent lights hum overhead. Wood benches creak when people shift. And the smell is less about justice and more about paper and floor wax. But the weight in the air, that part is real. When I walked into the county courthouse, I wasn't just a father anymore. I was a witness. A piece of evidence in a case where my own son sat on the other side of the aisle. The jury filed in, eyes scanning the room. Some avoided looking at Ethan, others glanced at me and then quickly away. Nobody looked comfortable. Why would they? They were about to weigh a son against his father, blood against blood. The judge called us to order, her gavel sharp against the wood. The district attorney rose first. His voice was steady, almost gentle, like he wanted to guide the jury into the story without spooking them. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a case about trust, he began. Trust given and trust betrayed. You will hear how the defendant, Ethan Dalton, knowingly sent his father a bottle of whiskey laced with a lethal toxin. You will see how that bottle nearly killed another man. And you will hear, in the defendant's own actions, the intent to end a life. The words landed like stones in the quiet. I could see a few jurors shift, leaning forward slightly. Then came the defense. Ethan's lawyer, Caldwell, was smooth as glass. Silver hair, crisp suit, and a smile that looked like it had been practiced in mirrors. He walked the jury through a different story, one of misunderstandings, family rifts, and resentments. The prosecution would have you believe this is a case of attempted murder, he said, voice sliding like oil. But what we have here is a father and son with a strained relationship. A father who sold property without his son's input. A father who may not always tell the full truth. And a gift, a bottle of whiskey that could have been tainted long before it ever reached Mr. Dalton's home. Ladies and gentlemen, doubt is the cornerstone of justice. And you will find more than enough doubt here. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He planted seeds, and you could see some of the jurors already wrestling with them. Robert Carson was called first. He walked slowly to the stand, cane in hand, but his voice was steady when he described the night he drank the whiskey. I remember the taste, he told the jury. Bitter. Different. Not like any whiskey I'd had before. Within an hour, I couldn't stand without help. I thought it was my heart giving out. He paused, letting the silence linger. Turns out, it wasn't my heart. It was someone else's idea. Caldwell tried to shake him, asked about his medications, about mixing them with alcohol, about whether stress or age could have been the cause. Robert's answer cut through. Son, I've been on these meds for 10 years. Never once ended up in the hospital until that night. The jury liked that. You could see it in their faces. Then came Reyes. He laid out the timeline cleanly. The package, the lab results, the missing vial, the notebook found in Ethan's garage. He presented the phone records, the burner number, the dosage instructions. When the DA asked him to read one of the texts aloud, the room went silent. Make sure he gets it all in the first pour. Won't take much with his heart. Some jurors stiffened. One woman in the front row pressed her lips together, as if holding back a reaction. Finally, my name was called. I took the stand, swore in, and sat down. The DA started soft. My age, my relationship to Ethan, the day of the package. I told it all straight, the whiskey on my porch, the missing label on the vial, the silence on the phone when I told Ethan I'd given the bottle to Robert. I spoke the facts, not my feelings. I kept my voice steady because men like Reyes had told me, let the evidence do the work. Then Caldwell stood. Mr. Dalton, he said smoothly, you claim you recognize my client's handwriting on the note, but you hadn't seen that handwriting in years, correct? That's correct. So it's possible you're mistaken? No, I said. I know my son's hand. He smiled faintly, as if humoring a child. Then he lifted a paper. Interesting, because we have here a certified handwriting analysis that says the note could not have been written by Ethan Dalton. Murmurs rippled through the room. The judge banged her gavel for order, but the seed was planted. Caldwell pressed further. Isn't it true you and your son have had a strained relationship? That you sold property, his mother's property, without consulting him? The DA objected. The judge sustained. But the damage was done. The jury had heard it. By the time I stepped down, my legs felt heavier than they had in years. Outside the courtroom, Reyes caught my arm. They're throwing dirt, he said quietly. Doesn't matter if it's true. They just want to cloud the water. Don't let it stick. But I could already feel it sticking. Caldwell's voice lingered, oily and smooth, whispering in the jury's ears. Inside, I told myself the evidence was enough. But outside, I knew shadows move quicker than light. And in that courtroom, truth wasn't just fighting lies. It was fighting the story my son's lawyer wanted to sell, a story where I was bitter, old, and wrong. The trial stretched on for days that felt like years. Testimonies, cross-examinations, motions, each piece another stone dropped into a pond already rippling with tension. I sat through all of it, day after day, watching strangers weigh the life of my son against the proof of what he had done. The prosecution leaned on the notebook. Every page was projected onto a screen for the jury. The measurements, the symbols, the initials. R.C. F.D. The jurors leaned in, pens scratching against notepads, faces taut with focus. The defense leaned on me. Caldwell painted me as he dredged up the property I sold years ago. The dinners even hadn't shown up. The silence between us that had grown into a canyon. This is a father who feels abandoned, he said, voice smooth. A father willing to twist anything to justify his hurt. I sat still as he said it, but the words burned. Not because they were true, but because they carried pieces of truth sharpened into weapons. When both sides rested, the jury disappeared behind closed doors. Hours passed. The courtroom filled with whispers and the restless shifting of bodies. I kept my eyes on the wood grain of the table in front of me, tracing the dark lines like they were paths on a map. Finally, the bailiff called us to rise. The jury filed back in. 12 faces, carved in stone. The foreman stood. We, the jury, find the defendant, Ethan Dalton. He paused, a breath stretching a lifetime. Guilty of attempted murder. The words fell like a hammer. The judge nodded, the gavel cracked, and the silence afterward was deafening. I didn't look at Ethan right away. Not when the courtroom buzzed with reaction. Not when Caldwell leaned in to whisper something in his ear. Not even when the judge set a date for sentencing. But when I finally did, when my eyes finally met my son's, I didn't see anger or regret or even fear. I saw something colder. Resentment. A steady glare that said he hadn't lost, not in the way that mattered to him. And in that moment, I understood. The verdict was justice, but justice wasn't victory. The weeks after blurred together. The newspaper ran its headlines. Local man convicted of poisoning attempt. Neighbors avoided my eye in the grocery store, torn between pity and curiosity. Some offered quiet condolences. Others just stared. The house felt heavier. The silence different now, less like absence, more like aftermath. Robert recovered slowly. The doctor said his heart would never be the same, but he was alive. Alive because of chance, because I hadn't taken that first drink, because fate had put the glass in his hand instead of mine. When I visited him, he gripped my shoulder with a strength that surprised me. "Don't carry it, Frank," he said. "It's not yours to carry." But his eyes said he knew I would anyway. Leah filed for divorce. She came by once, quietly, to thank me. "You gave me clarity," she said, voice raw. "It's awful clarity, but it's still clarity." She left before I could respond, her car disappearing down the street like a chapter closing itself. At sentencing, Ethan stood before the judge, hands cuffed, suit wrinkled from nights in county holding. The DA read a statement about intent, about danger to the community, about how the evidence spoke louder than excuses. Caldwell spoke too, about a troubled young man, about family fractures, about a future wasted. When the judge pronounced 15 years, I watched Ethan's shoulders stiffen, but his face stayed blank. No outburst. No plea. Just that same stare, cold and steady, locked on me like a final message. Afterward, I walked out of the courthouse alone. The October wind cut across the parking lot, sharp as glass, carrying the smell of burning leaves. I stood by my truck for a long moment, staring at the horizon. Justice had been done. The law had recognized the truth. But peace? Peace was something else. I thought back to that morning, the package on my porch, the bottle glowing in the sunlight, the card with 2 empty words, "Happy Birthday." A gift that was never a gift. A page in a story my son had tried to end before I could read it. Now the story was mine again, but it wasn't one I would have chosen. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, the mason jar still in the fridge, the notebook sealed away in an evidence locker. I thought about burning the legal pad, tearing up the lists of what I knew and what I could prove. But I didn't. The lists had become part of me now, the ink pressed deep enough to leave scars, even if the paper vanished. I poured myself a glass of water, sat in the same silence that had been my only company for years, and let the truth settle. Justice had protected me, but justice had not healed me. And some wounds, the kind written in your own son's hand, never close.